3 months of silence. That was the deal Brooke Sullivan made with herself when she took the night shift at Oak Creek Memorial in Denver. 3 months of being nobody. Just a nurse. Just hands that followed orders, eyes that looked down, a voice that apologized for existing. No one from her old life knew where she'd gone after the breakdown, after the nightmares became unbearable, after she'd turned in her trident and disappeared into civilian obscurity. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer above her head as she moved through the emergency department at 0230, her badge clipped to scrubs that smelled of antiseptic and the particular exhaustion that comes from knowing you'll never sleep right again. Brooke pushed a supply cart down the corridor, her tablet glowing in the dark corridor. Inventory counts. That was the safe work. Numbers didn't judge you. Numbers didn't ask questions about scars or why your hands trembled whenever a stretcher crashed through the bay doors like artillery fire. She'd been a nurse for 7 years now, 3 of those in the shadow of Oak Creek's night shift, where the broken came in waves and the competent one stayed invisible. The morphine count was off again. 87 milliliters missing from the last 48 hours. Orthopedic equipment logged as used but never appearing on procedure sheets. She made a note on her tablet. Then she moved on. Noticing things could get you killed in hospitals the same way it had in Helmand Province. Doctors didn't like nurses who noticed. The intercom crackled above her. Code activation. Trauma Bay 3. Highway accident, ETA 2 minutes. Brooke's shoulders straightened. This was the part that still made sense. Everything else was performance. This was real. She moved toward the trauma bays with the kind of purposeful efficiency that came from muscle memory, the kind that lived in tendons and neurons and places that didn't obey her brain's insistence that she was retired. Her badge clattered against her ribs as she moved. The paramedics burst through the bay doors at 0247 like they were bringing in a body instead of a patient. 23-year-old male, unconscious on arrival, ejected from a 2016 Dodge Ram at mile marker 84 on I-25, no wallet, no phone, no ID. They'd been searching him for medical alert information for the last 8 minutes. Nothing. The guy was a ghost. Brooke positioned herself at the patient's left side as they transferred him to the trauma bed, smooth coordination, practiced movements, every hand knowing its job. She was already performing her initial assessment, pupils, responsiveness, bleeding points, the invisible triage that separated survival from the alternative. That was when she heard his shoes. Expensive Italian leather on linoleum tile. The particular gait of a man who'd never questioned his right to any room he entered. Dr. James Hargrove swept into Trauma Bay 3 like he was checking his watch, his tailored charcoal suit somehow remaining pristine in an emergency department where blood eventually found everything. He was 48, with the kind of symmetrical face that came from old money and aesthetic procedures, and he looked at Brooke for exactly 2 seconds while she worked. 2 seconds. That was all it took. She was cutting away the patient's blood-soaked jacket with trauma shears, her movements precise and efficient, her eyes tracking for hidden injuries. The jacket was shredded polyester and diesel fuel smell, the kind of cheap work coat that fell apart under the blade. Hargrove watched her fingers move. He watched her do a rapid primary survey without speaking a single unnecessary word. He watched her hands find the subclavian artery area and her eyes narrow as she assessed the breathing pattern, the chest rise, the subtle asymmetry that meant something was wrong in ways that mattered. Under 15 seconds. That was how long it took her to identify trauma presentation, segregate the critical findings, and know exactly what the CT scan would probably show before they even got him upstairs. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He didn't like what he'd just seen. Competence was fine. Competence was expected. But instinctive competence, the kind that only came from experience, from trauma rooms that numbered in the hundreds, from hands that knew things before the brain had time to catch up, that was different. That was dangerous. A nurse like that eventually noticed things. Inventory discrepancies. Billing patterns. The kinds of things that could interrupt a very profitable arrangement with a medical supply company that billed for equipment orders that existed only on spreadsheets and in the bank accounts of administrators willing to look the other way. Brooke's hands were working on the jacket removal now, peeling away the layers to expose the full extent of the trauma. The patient was wearing a military-issue tan shirt underneath, worn soft from 100 combat deployments worth of washing. She noted that. She filed it away in the part of her brain that had been trained to notice such things and keep silent. But then her shears caught on something in the jacket lining, something metallic that caught the overhead light like a signal flare. She stopped moving. Muscle memory took over. Her eyes flicked to the item, registered it, and her entire nervous system shifted into something that looked like nothing but felt like everything. Sewn into the inner lining of the jacket, faded from desert sun and careful preservation, was a unit patch. Tan and black. A Ranger scroll. The same patch she'd worn stitched to her own uniform for 12 years across 3 combat zones. Her hand froze on the shears. The room didn't change. The heart monitor kept its steady rhythm. The fluorescent lights continued their electric hum. But something in the architecture of Brooke's chest reorganized itself into a configuration she hadn't felt in 417 days. She covered the patch quickly with gauze, her movements still efficient, still professional, still invisible. But her pupils had dilated. Her breathing had shifted. And for the first time in 3 months, Brooke Sullivan felt the presence of someone else from that other life, the one she'd buried in a civilian grave and walked away from. She stepped back from the bed. That was when Hargrove moved closer, his expensive shoes clicking on the tile floor with the sound of a man who'd never considered that any place might not welcome him. He glanced at the patient, then back at Brooke with an expression that suggested he'd forgotten she was even there. "Get his baseline vitals," Hargrove said. Not a request. Not even a question. Just a command delivered to someone he'd already assessed and filed away. Full neuro check. "I want imaging in the next 20 minutes. Brooke nodded. "Understood, doctor." Her voice came out exactly as it should, deferential, careful, the voice of someone who knew her place in a hierarchy that had no room for argument. She moved to the monitor, pulling up the vital sign trends, beginning the systematic assessment that would determine whether this unconscious ranger had spinal injuries, head trauma, internal bleeding, or some combination that would require heroic measures and decisions that belong to men in expensive suits. The patient's oxygen saturation was 91%. His heart rate was 112, elevated but compensating. His blood pressure was 98/62, which meant somewhere inside his body, he was losing blood volume in ways that weren't yet visible. But Brooke's hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this before. Not as a civilian nurse. As something else. Something she'd promised herself she'd left behind. She hooked him to the monitor. She ran the 12-lead EKG, watching the printout emerge from the machine with its own story about whether the cardiac tissue was damaged or angry or both. She started and for in the right antecubital fossa with a 16-gauge angiocath, the needle going in smooth as insertion into water, and drew labs for typing and crossmatch in case the surgeon needed to go into damage control resuscitation. And the entire time, she was aware of the patch. Of the man in the trauma bed. Of the fact that some kind of coordinate had just pinged on a map she thought she'd burned. Hargrove was speaking to the resident now, that particular tone of institutional authority that made younger doctors want to disappear into the walls. "This one's probably a trauma alert. Get surgery consulted. I want him CT'd before he goes upstairs." He delivered the orders like he was reading a menu. Then he left, his shoes clicking away toward the next crisis, the next opportunity to impose his version of reality on people who didn't know they had a choice. Brooke stood at the patient's bedside, her hand on the rail. Underneath the gauze, the patch was still there. Still waiting. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator, if they needed one, which they probably would, hadn't yet arrived. The room existed in that specific moment between crisis and tragedy, the in-between space where survival was still theoretically possible. She looked at the man's face. Young. Scarred along the right temple. The kind of bearing even unconscious, even broken, that came from living a life where people died if you made mistakes. She'd trained soldiers like that once. She'd worked alongside rangers who'd bled into the sand and gotten back up anyway. She reached down and checked the dressing over the gauze covering the patch, making sure it was secure. Making sure it stayed invisible. Making sure this man's secret stayed as buried as her own. The clock on the wall read 0252. The night was still long. And Brooke Sullivan, 3 months deep into her carefully constructed anonymity, had just encountered someone who wore the same history she did, who carried the same stories in scars and service marks and patches sewn into linings by hands that had seen combat and wanted something to survive it. She checked the monitor again. 02 sat 93 and stable. HR holding at 108. She made a note on his chart. Then she turned and walked out of the bay, her shoes quiet on the linoleum, her face giving away nothing of the fact that everything had just changed in the span of 15 seconds, and a glimpse of faded fabric that connected her past to a present she'd tried so hard to leave behind. The nurse's station hummed with the ordinary chaos of morning shift change, fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular hospital white that made time feel suspended. Brooke was 3 months into her anonymity at Oak Creek Memorial, 3 months of night shifts and blank stares and the careful art of being invisible. She'd learned to time her breaks so she wouldn't have to sit in the cafeteria during lunch. She'd learned which routes through the hospital let her avoid the attending physician's offices. She'd learned that if you stayed quiet enough, stayed competent enough, nobody asked questions about the gaps in your past. Dr. Hargrove gathered 3 residents around the central desk, his voice pitched to carry across the floor, not quite loud enough to be obviously performing, but loud enough that the calculation was visible to anyone paying attention. Brooke registered the tone before the words registered. $10 says the new girl doesn't last a week, he said, glancing toward her with the kind of smile that made the fluorescent lights feel colder. These quiet types never do. They crack under real pressure. Right, Nightingale. The residents snickered. One of them, a tall kid with the particular cruelty of someone still learning how power felt, laughed like they were part of an inside joke they hadn't yet earned. Brooke's pen stopped moving for exactly 1 second. Then it continued. Her charting didn't skip a beat. Her eyes didn't rise. But her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind of minute adjustment that would only register if someone was paying very close attention, which she was, to herself, always. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 18 years of taking orders, making split-second decisions under fire, holding bleeding men together with her hands and her voice. 18 years of earning the respect of people who could actually kill her. And now she was being mocked by a man whose biggest crisis this week was probably a golf handicap. She didn't respond. That was the real power. Non-response was a kind of answer. It said she wasn't worth engaging, wasn't worth her energy, wasn't worth breaking her composure over. Hargrove waited for some sign of cracking, some flush of embarrassment or anger. He got nothing but the soft scratch of her pen against the patient chart. He turned away, already reaching for the next slight, the next test of her boundaries. He could feel something in her, something solid and unmoved, and it bothered him. Threats that didn't respond to threats were dangerous. The cafeteria at noon was crowded with the particular density of hospital midday, nurses grabbing 15 minutes between traumas, orderlies refueling before the afternoon rush, residents pretending their coffee was a full meal. Brooke sat at a table near the window with her tray, soup, salad, water. She was already reviewing the day in her mind, the lab she needed to check, the bed turns coming at 1300, the medication reconciliation for the new admit in Bay 7. She wasn't looking up when Hargrove walked past. He moved with deliberate casualness, the kind of calculated accident that was calculated right up to the moment it stopped being an accident. His hip caught her table hard enough to send her tray clattering to the floor. Soup splashed across the tiles in a rust-colored arc. Her water bottle spun across the floor like it was looking for somewhere to hide. The salad scattered, letters spinning like confetti at a celebration for nobody. The room went dead silent. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward the sound, toward Brooke, toward Hargrove standing there with an expression of mock concern. "Oops," he said, his voice carrying the smooth texture of false apology. "Better clean that up before someone slips. Liability and all." His residents laughed, that same learned cruelty, the sound of people still building their sense of power on the backs of people they'd been told were weaker. Brooke stared at the mess for a moment. One measured breath. Then she stood, moved to the paper towel dispenser with the kind of fluid precision that came from years of moving through spaces efficiently, economically, without wasted motion. She began kneeling down to wipe, and that's when the single tear escaped, not from sadness, not from humiliation, but from the sheer pressure of holding everything down so completely that your body finds a way to leak. She wiped it with the back of her hand without looking up, without breaking her focus on the spreading mess, without giving Hargrove the satisfaction of seeing her face. The cafeteria remained silent. Nobody helped her. Nobody told Hargrove to go to hell. They just watched while this small quiet nurse cleaned up her own deliberate destruction, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who'd cleaned up worse things than spilled soup in spaces where the stakes were incomparably higher. She didn't need them to help. She didn't need them to intervene. But the silence was a message all the same. Even in their passivity, they were choosing. They were choosing to watch. By that afternoon, Hargrove had moved past casual humiliation into something with more velocity. The patient chart appeared at Brooke's feet without warning. Hargrove had stormed to her station and released it like a weapon, papers cascading across the floor in that particular disordered spray that charts achieve when they're dropped from a height. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice dropping low enough that this could be framed as a private conversation if anyone questioned it later. "Your charting is sloppy. Your med reconciliation is late. If you can't keep up with basic documentation, maybe you should find easier work." The words were calibrated, not quite loud enough to hear clearly, but loud enough that everyone would notice something was happening. That was the real skill in this kind of humiliation. Making it public enough to hurt, private enough to defend. Brooke looked at the scattered papers. Then she looked up at his face. She took one measured breath, the kind of breath that comes before you've made a decision about what you're going to say, the kind that creates space between stimulus and response. A single tear escaped down her left eye. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. In a voice like still water, not soft, not weak, but the kind of calm that comes from the bottom of something deep and cold and ancient, she said, "I've been called worse by better men, doctor." The room froze. Not like people were shocked. Like they'd just realized something was different about the quiet nurse they'd dismissed. Like they'd just glimpsed the ghost of something beneath the surface. Hargrove's jaw tightened, a single muscle contracting at the hinge, and for a moment his hand clenched like he was considering something he'd regret. Then he turned on his heel and walked away without responding, which was worse than any response could have been. Non-response was an admission. She'd broken his script. What neither of them understood, what Hargrove had no way of knowing as he retreated to his office to make calls to board members, was what was happening in Trauma Bay 3. The John Doe patient was sleeping the heavy unconscious sleep of head trauma and road rash, his vitals stable, his monitors beeping their mechanical rhythm. He wore a jacket that had been carefully catalogued and bagged and now lay folded on the metal shelf above his bed. Inside that jacket, sewn into the lining with thread that had been frayed and resewn 100 times over, was a unit patch. Faded. Worn. The colors almost bleeding into each other from years of being pressed against a chest that had moved through places most people only saw on maps if they looked. Brooke checked on him at 2100, the way she checked on all her patients, thorough, efficient, careful. Her hands were steady as she peeled back the gauze over his ribs and examined the unit patch more closely. 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. The same insignia. The same colors. The same unit that had appeared on a photograph on her son's dresser 5,000 miles away, right before he deployed to a place called Helmand Province where her hands had learned to be steady because hesitation meant dying. Her hand started shaking. Just for a moment. Just enough to register as a thing that had happened, as a small break in the composure she'd spent 18 years constructing. She pulled out her phone, a contact photo of her son in uniform, the patch visible on his shoulder, and quickly put it away before anyone could see. She stared at the unconscious man's face for a long moment, trying to fit this impossible coincidence into the careful compartments of her life. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed everything. At midnight, Hargrove cornered her in the supply room between the suture kits and the 4 lines. His presence filled the small space like something with weight and temperature. "I've been reviewing your hiring paperwork," he said, his voice taking on that particular tone of false concern that meant he was testing something. "Your references are thin. Your previous employment has gaps. I'm wondering if you've been entirely truthful about your qualifications." Brooke met his eyes. Her voice came out flat. "Everything I submitted is accurate." "We'll see," he said, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling your listed references tomorrow. All of them." He left before she could respond, which meant he'd already made up his mind about what he was going to find, or more likely, he'd already made up his mind about what he was going to tell people he'd found. Brooke's composure cracked for a moment in that narrow space between the sterile packages. She gripped the shelf hard enough that her knuckles went white, breathing in the smell of antiseptic and latex, breathing out the 14 years of distance she'd carefully constructed between her military life and this anonymous night shift existence. She'd taken this job specifically because nobody from her past knew where she'd gone. Not her commanding officers. Not her sister. Not the Navy Department liaisons who tried to convince her to take desk positions instead of walking away entirely. If Hargrove dug into her past, he'd find the gaps. He'd find the years where her employment history simply stopped. He'd find the decorations she'd never mentioned, the tours she'd never referenced, the fact that she'd walked away from a life that men spent their whole careers trying to reach. And once he found those things, he'd weaponize them. That was what men like Hargrove did with secrets. They turned them into leverage. At 0245, alarm screamed from Bay 3. The monitor was shrieking, that particular high-pitched wail that meant something fundamental had changed. Brooke sprinted toward the sound, her feet moving before her mind caught up, her body remembering how to run toward crisis instead of away from it. She found the Ranger's oxygen saturation plummeting, dropping like a stone, 94 to 88 to 79, and his trachea deviating, shifted away from the center of his chest like someone was pushing it sideways. His jugular veins were distended, swollen with pressure, and his breathing had become labored, desperate, the sound of a body trying to survive something it wasn't built to survive. Tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed, and the air was accumulating in the space between his lung and his chest wall, compressing his heart, crushing the vessels that were supposed to pump his blood. The pressure was building. The clock was counting down. 75% of patients in tension pneumothorax don't make it to the OR. That was when everything Brooke had tried to bury woke up inside her, and she stopped being a quiet anonymous nurse. She became something else. The monitor screamed its high-pitched warning at 0300 hours. 02 sat dropping. 91, 87. 82, Dr. Patel's hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen mid-keystroke, his eyes locked on the numbers that kept falling like stones down a well. The Ranger's chest heaved once, twice, then stopped expanding on the left side. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was pulling the mediastinum, compressing the right ventricle, suffocating him from the inside while his heart still beat uselessly against the pressure. 15 seconds. That's all they had. He needs a chest tube. We need to page thoracic surgery, get him upstairs. Patel's voice climbed an octave with each word, panic bleeding into every syllable like ink spreading through water. There's no time. Brooke was already moving, her body responding to a rhythm her conscious mind had tried to bury for 7 years. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, the latex snapping against her wrists with the sharp report of a rifle bolt. He'll code in 90 seconds. 80 now. She swabbed the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line with an alcohol prep pad, the antiseptic smell cutting through the warm copper scent of blood and the mechanical wheeze of the ventilator. Her fingers knew exactly where to go. They always did. A 14-gauge needle and catheter sat ready in her other hand. She'd grabbed them without thinking, muscle memory reaching before conscious thought could catch up. Hands that had held lives together in the helm and dust moved now with the same terrifying fluid precision, the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. The needle went in. Perfect angle. Perfect depth. Between the ribs, through the parietal pleura, into the pneumothorax space, and then came the hiss. That unmistakable, perfect hiss of pressurized air escaping from where it had no right to be. The sound of a life being given back its room to breathe. The monitor steadied. 88, 91, 94. The ranger's chest expanded on both sides now, symmetrical and full, his body pulling oxygen into lungs that moments before had been crushed flat. Patel stared at her with the expression of someone watching a miracle resolve itself into medical physics. How did you or where did you learn? Dr. Hargrove. The voice came from the doorway like a door slamming shut. The ER director stood there in his pristine white coat, the overhead fluorescent light catching the gel in his hair, turning it into a helmet of surgical precision. His eyes moved from the needle to Brooke's face to the monitor to the ranger, cataloging everything in that quick, predatory way of a man whose mind was already running scenarios. You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. Do you understand what you've just done? Brooke peeled off her gloves. Her hands were still perfectly steady. That would matter later. His lung collapsed. He had 90 seconds before. I know what a tension pneumothorax is, Sullivan. The way he said her name, just her last name, no title, no Ms., the clinical erasure of identity, had the temperature in the room drop 5 degrees. What I'm asking is whether you understand hospital protocol. Standing orders. The chain of command. The fact that you are a nurse, not a physician. She turned to face him fully. Her eyes were the color of weathered steel, and something in them made Patel take a step backward. He was dying. And I'm sure a jury will find that very sympathetic when we discuss your suspended license. Hargrove stepped further into the bay, his shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of a predator's approach. Security is on their way. You'll surrender your badge, your access codes, and any hospital property in your possession. You're suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation into whether you falsified your credentials, your nursing background, your references, all of it. The words came like a series of small explosions, each one detonating the careful architecture of anonymity she'd built over 3 months. Her pulse stayed level. Her breathing remained controlled. But inside, something recognized the moment the roof started coming down. I was trained in emergency procedures. Combat medic certification covers. Combat medic. Hargrove smiled. It was the kind of smile a shark might give just before the strike. That's interesting, Sullivan. Because your application says you were a civilian RN. No military experience listed. No certifications beyond standard nursing licensure. Which means you either lied to Oak Creek Memorial, or you're lying to me right now. Either way, this conversation is over. Security arrived 3 minutes later, 2 officers in dark uniforms with a practiced disinterest that suggested they'd done this before, escorted nurses and respiratory therapists and lab techs out of hospitals before. Hargrove spoke to them in low tones, his eyes never leaving Brooke as he gestured toward her with the contempt one might reserve for a piece of equipment that had malfunctioned beyond repair. She removed her gloves slowly. Set them in the hazmat bin. Untied her scrubs, the ones that smelled of antiseptic and stress sweat and the particular chemistry of a trauma unit at 3 in the morning. As they walked her toward the elevator, she glanced back at Trauma Bay 3. The ranger's chest rose and fell with the mechanical precision of the ventilator. His oxygen saturation held steady at 97%. Alive. Breathing. Alive because of what her hands had done, her knowledge, her body's remembrance of protocols written into muscle and bone and neural pathways by years of war. The elevator door slid open with a pneumatic hiss and she stepped inside. The doors closed. The descent began. At 0430, Brooke sat in the darkness of her apartment in scrubs still damp with sweat. The place was small, a studio in a building that didn't ask questions, on a street where anonymity was currency and silence was the only conversation most people wanted. She'd chosen it deliberately. 3 months ago, she'd walked away from every public thing she'd ever been, the rank, the unit, the medals locked in a safety deposit box at a bank she'd never visited again. She'd become a name. A social security number. A person who showed up on time and did her job with the meticulous precision of someone building a wall brick by brick, trying to make herself invisible. The wall had just collapsed. Her phone sat on the floor beside her, a rectangle of black glass that probably meant termination calls were already being assembled, reference checks were being made, and somewhere in the hospital's HR office, someone was pulling her employment file and searching for the discrepancies Hargrove had seeded into the investigation like a hunter laying traps. He'd done this before. She could tell by the way he'd moved, the language he'd used, not anger, but calculation. Not impulse, but strategy. He saw her as a threat and he was removing that threat with the same meticulous efficiency she'd just used to save a dying man's life. She thought about the ranger. About his steady breathing. About the way his chest had expanded when the air pressure released, as if he'd taken his first breath ever, as if the world was new and full and possible. She thought about her 10-year-old daughter, asleep in the bedroom next to this one, dreaming whatever dreams children dream when they don't yet know that the adults in their lives are falling apart. She thought about the moment when everything would come into focus, the questions, the confusion, the simple incomprehension of a child watching her mother's life dissolve like sugar in rain. The silence in the apartment was so thick you could operate in it. Brooke sat in the darkness and waited for her phone to ring. It would ring. It always did. There was no version of this story where she got to stay buried, where the anonymous nurse stayed anonymous, where the woman who'd spent 3 months building a life from nothing got to keep building it. The ranger had been the domino. His collapse had been the lever that moved everything else, and now the cascade was beginning. Hargrove would make his calls. The board members who owed him favors would take those calls. The investigation would accelerate. The walls would close in. The woman who'd walked away from everything to become nothing would discover that nothing was the one thing she'd never be allowed to be. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, at 0430 hours, Brooke Sullivan sat in the darkness of her apartment in scrubs that still carried the smell of a trauma unit and the ghost memory of a needle sliding between ribs with perfect precision, and she waited. Her hands, finally, had started to shake. The clock on Brooke's apartment wall read for 24 a.m. She sat motionless at her kitchen table in scrubs that still smelled of antiseptic and adrenaline, her hands folded flat against the laminate surface to keep them from shaking. The needle decompression had been flawless. Her hands had known exactly where to go, how much pressure, when to listen for that specific hiss of air escaping a lung that had collapsed like a fist clenching. But flawless meant nothing now. Flawless meant suspended. Flawless meant terminated. Outside her window, Denver was still dark. The streetlights cast long shadows across the parking lot below, and somewhere in that darkness, her daughter was asleep in the next room, unaware that her mother's carefully constructed life had just come apart at the seams. By 8:15 a.m. that same morning, Dr. Hargrove was making phone calls from his office at Oak Creek Memorial. His secretary had been instructed to hold his schedule. The calls needed to be made when the timing was perfect, when suspension protocols were still fresh, when the narrative could be shaped before questions were asked. He'd already drafted the summary, unauthorized invasive procedure. Credential discrepancies. Patient endangerment. It read like gospel to anyone who didn't look too closely. The first call went to Richard Bancroft, chief of radiology, a man who owed Hargrove $14,000 in country club markers from a particularly bad weekend in Aspen 2 years ago. Hargrove's voice was calm, professional, concerned. "Richard, I need to flag something that came up during our credentialing review. This new nurse on nights, Sullivan, she performed a needle decompression on a trauma patient without physician authorization. At 0300 hours. While I was reviewing protocol, it became clear she may have misrepresented her background. I'm concerned about our liability exposure. I wanted to reach out before this escalates." Bancroft, listening from his office with a cup of coffee growing cold on his desk, heard what he needed to hear: liability. Exposure. The magic words. "What do you need?" he asked. "Just your perspective at the board level," Hargrove said smoothly. "When this comes up, and it will, I wanted to make sure you understood the full context. Unauthorized procedures. Credential gaps. We need to move quickly to protect the hospital. By 8:13 a.m., Hargrove had made 2 more calls with identical framing. Each board member he contacted had something to lose, something Hargrove remembered like a card catalogue of secrets: a daughter in a hospital-subsidized medical residency, a wife who'd benefited from a no-bid contract, a consulting fee that existed more on paper than in reality. The calls weren't threats. They were reminders. They were insurance policies being paid out in the currency of institutional loyalty. At 9:15 a.m., Hargrove made a different kind of call. This one was to a clinic supervisor named Patricia Gutierrez, who'd worked with Brooke 2 years ago in a community health center in Aurora before Brooke had simply disappeared from the system. Hargrove's voice was sympathetic, almost apologetic. "Ms. Gutierrez, I'm Dr. Hargrove, Director of Emergency Medicine at Oak Creek Memorial. We're conducting a routine credentialing review for one of our night shift nurses, Brooke Sullivan. She listed you as a reference. I had a few questions about her employment with you, specifically around her qualifications and any gaps in her background that might not have been addressed." Patricia hesitated. She'd like Brooke. Quiet, competent, always there for the harder shifts. But she was also cautious, and caution in the face of a hospital director's questioning sounded like fear. "Well, she was excellent clinically," Patricia said carefully. "But I wouldn't say I had complete visibility into her background. There were some employment gaps before she came to us." "How significant?" Hargrove pressed gently. "I don't know. 3, 4 years?" She didn't really discuss it. That was all Hargrove needed. He thanked her politely and ended the call, already knowing how this would be documented: reference unable to confirm continuous employment history. Significant gaps unaccounted for. Possible credential misrepresentation. He'd never claimed she lied. He'd just suggested the possibility with enough precision to make the question official. The second reference call went to a nursing school administrator at the University of Colorado, a woman Hargrove had cultivated over 3 years of hospital donations to their scholarship fund. Her name was Dr. Ellen Chen, and she understood how these calls worked. When Hargrove asked if there were any concerns about Brooke Sullivan's licensure, Chen's response was immediately cautious. "We have complete records showing she completed the program," Chen said carefully. "But there were some disciplinary matters during clinical rotations that were resolved internally." Hargrove's pen moved across his notepad. "What kind of matters?" "Stress-related issues. She needed some counseling. It was handled confidentially, and she was cleared to graduate. But if you're asking me whether she disclosed something like that to your hospital, I couldn't tell you." By 11:16 a.m., Hargrove had the scaffold he needed. References expressing concern. Employment gaps. Undefined disciplinary history. Clinical judgment questions. Nothing provably false. Everything structurally devastating. At 2:16 p.m. that afternoon, a woman named Victoria Price arrived at Oak Creek Memorial with a leather portfolio and an expression of professional neutrality that had been honed across 17 hospitals. She was an outside HR consultant, the kind that institutions called when they needed distance between themselves and a predetermined outcome. Hargrove had already briefed her by phone that morning: an authorized procedure, credential concerns, pattern of behavior. The script was written. Victoria just needed to document it. She spent 2 hours with Hargrove and 3 other administrators, reviewing every shift Brooke had worked in the past 3 months. They pulled her charts, looking for delays in documentation. They examined her supply requests, cross-referencing them with Hargrove's inflated inventory logs, a comparison designed to make her careful tracking of discrepancies look like insubordination. They built a timeline, late charting on 3 occasions, questions about why the surgical kit counts didn't match the stored inventory, her presence in the supply closet at 2:02 a.m. on a night she was supposed to be in the unit. Pattern of concern, Victoria said, typing notes into her laptop with the efficiency of someone who'd written this same narrative dozens of times before. Questions about compliance with hospital protocols. Possible credential falsification. Incident of unauthorized invasive procedure. I'd recommend expedited termination hearing. Within the week. Hargrove nodded. This was exactly what he'd paid for. By 4:15 p.m., a certified letter had been prepared and signed by the hospital's legal counsel, a woman who'd never questioned Hargrove's judgment and wasn't about to start. The letter was short and formal. Ms. Sullivan, your employment with Oak Creek Memorial is under investigation for the following concerns: performance of invasive medical procedures without physician authorization, failure to disclose relevant employment gaps during credentialing, and inconsistent compliance with hospital policy. You are hereby suspended from all duties pending an investigation hearing scheduled for. And then a date 6 days forward, a date that would give Hargrove time to make sure every member of the termination committee understood which way the wind was blowing. The letter arrived at Brooke's apartment at 5:53 p.m., certified delivery, signature required. She'd expected it, but the paper in her hand still felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. That night, she told her daughter she had a stomach bug, that she might need to rest a few days. They ate cereal for dinner in front of a Disney movie that Brooke didn't process. Her daughter, Emma, was 9 years old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's observant nature, and she kept glancing at Brooke with the confusion of a child who knows something is wrong but doesn't have the language to ask. By day 3, Brooke had stopped pretending to go to work. She'd stopped pretending it was temporary. She sat in her car in parking lots, watching nurses arrive for shifts, watching them walk through the ER entrance with the easy confidence of people who belonged somewhere. She watched until Dawn painted the parking lot in watercolor grays, then drove home to shower before Emma woke. But this morning, day 4, she couldn't summon the energy to pretend anymore. At 2:15 p.m., Brooke sat at her kitchen table in a bathrobe, the termination letter spread in front of her like evidence at a crime scene. Her hands shook as they held her coffee mug. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. She was still drinking it anyway, unable to make the decision to get up and pour it out. Outside, Denver was gray and ordinary. Inside, her world was collapsing like a building with its supports removed. The sound of Emma's school bus brake hissing at the corner should have registered as a warning. Brooke heard it the way she heard traffic, as background noise that existed somewhere outside her immediate catastrophe. The front door opened. Emma's backpack thudded to the floor. Small shoes were kicked off, hitting the wall with the casual carelessness of a 9-year-old who'd had a normal day at school. Then Emma walked into the kitchen and stopped. She was still wearing her school uniform, plaid jumper, white socks, and her backpack was sliding off one shoulder. For 3 seconds, she just stood there in the kitchen doorway, processing the image in front of her, her mother at the table at 2:48 in the afternoon in a bathrobe, coffee mug in both hands like she was trying to hold something together, tear tracks visible on her face that she hadn't bothered to wipe away. Confusion broke across Emma's face like a wave hitting a shore that didn't expect it. "Mommy, why are you home early?" Emma asked, and the innocence in that question hit Brooke harder than Hargrove's investigation ever could. "Are you sick?" Brooke tried to speak. Her throat produced only air. Emma set down her backpack slowly, the way you move when you're approaching something wounded. She took 2 steps closer to her mother. "Mommy." Her voice had shifted from confused to scared, the way children's voices do when they realize that the adult in front of them is the one who needs protecting. Brooke reached for her daughter, but her hands were shaking too much to hold her steady. She pulled Emma close instead, buried her face in her daughter's hair that still smelled like playground dirt and the strawberry shampoo Emma insisted on, and let the tears come. Real ones this time. Not the controlled, single tear from the nurse's station. The kind that came from a place deeper than pride, from the core place where mothers hold the terror of not being able to protect their children. Emma held her small arms around her mother's shoulders and said nothing at all. 2 floors above that moment, in a hospital bed at Oak Creek Memorial, Captain Marcus Webb was beginning to surface from the sedation fog that had held him since his lung collapsed. His eyes flickered open. Fluorescent ceiling lights. The steady beep of a cardiac monitor. The plastic tube running into his arm. Reality came back in pieces, the highway, the impact, then nothing until now. A day shift nurse noticed his eyes opening and came over immediately, checking his pupils, his vitals, asking him how many fingers she was holding up. Webb answered automatically, and the nurse smiled. Welcome back, Captain. You had a rough night 4 days ago. What happened? His voice was gravel, the sound of someone who'd been intubated. Motor vehicle accident on I-25. Tension pneumothorax. Emergency needle decompression. You're lucky whoever did it knew what they were doing. Another few minutes and we would have lost you. Webb's eyes focused. Who? Who did the procedure? The nurse checked the chart. Nurse named Sullivan. Night shift. She's... And here the nurse paused, glancing at the chart again with the expression of someone suddenly realizing something she shouldn't have missed earlier. She's suspended now. There was some kind of incident with the attending. But Captain, she saved your life. Something flickered in Webb's eyes. Recognition. Memory. A fragment of something from a life that existed before the accident, before the sedation, from a time that felt both weeks away and years away. Get me her personnel file, Webb said, and his voice had changed. It was no longer gravel. It was a command. Now. I want to know everything about her. The nurse hesitated for exactly half a second, then nodded. That tone was military. That was a man used to being obeyed. Within the hour, Webb was holding a file with a civilian name on it and reading through the sparse employment history that Hargrove had so carefully cultivated the appearance of concern about. Nothing made sense. A woman named Brooke Sullivan with somehow simultaneously incomplete credentials and emergency medicine instincts so precise that she'd saved his life with her hands in the dark. Webb stared at the name for a long time. Then he closed his eyes and lay back against the hospital pillow, understanding only that something was wrong, and that whatever happened next was going to change everyone. The conference room fell silent when they wheeled Captain Marcus Webb through the doors. His eyes found Brooke across the long table in 3 seconds flat. The machines trailed behind him like metal ghosts, 4 poles, oxygen tank, a heart monitor still beeping its mechanical rhythm. He stared at her the way a man stares at someone he thought was dead. Then he whispered one word, phantom. The sound cut through the fluorescent hum like a blade. Brooke's hands went still on the personnel file in front of her. No tremor. No flinch. Just absolute stillness, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Hargrove shifted in his chair, confused. The board members exchanged glances. None of them understood what that single word meant. Her daughter did. 10-year-old Emma stood up from the chair where she'd been sitting, small frame rigid, and spoke in a voice that didn't waver. That's Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, sir. The words came out clipped, precise, the same way she'd heard soldiers speak at the base before everything fell apart. That's my mom. And you don't know who you're standing next to. Brooke turned toward her daughter slowly. Emma's chin was set. Her hands were fists at her sides. The girl had watched her mother break at the kitchen table. She had heard the phone calls with the hospital board. She had seen her mother's face as 3 months of anonymity crumbled into ash. And now, looking at this child who had learned strength by watching her mother absorb cruelty in silence, Brooke understood that Emma had been waiting for this moment. Waiting to speak the name her mother had tried so hard to bury. What is this? Hargrove's voice cracked like aged wood. What's she talking about? Brooke opened the personnel file with both hands. The motion was deliberate. Unhurried. She turned it toward the board chair, toward the cameras that were now rolling in the hallway where a Justice Department investigator had been waiting with federal warrants for 4 days. 3 months of careful anonymity. 3 months of becoming nobody. And now it was ending in a conference room at Oak Creek Memorial with her daughter standing beside her. The file contained deployment records spanning 3 combat zones. Helmand Province, 2008. Kuna Province, 2010. Sanjan Valley, 2012. 16 months of active service across 3 separate tours. The medical certifications. The commendations. The fitness reports written by commanding officers whose names carried weight. Then she turned to the next page, and the room's temperature seemed to drop. 2 silver stars. Bronze star with Valor. 2 purple hearts. Navy Cross. Captain Webb rolled his chair closer. His voice was steady now, the voice of a man who had spent for days waiting to say this. Senior Chief Sullivan pulled 5 men out of a burning MIP in Helmand Province while taking direct fire from 2 separate positions. That's a Navy Cross. That's the 2nd highest award for valor in the Navy. She did it on her knees in the sand. She did it knowing she was hit twice. She did it because that's what we do. His eyes moved across the board members. I've served 22 years. I've deployed with Rangers, Delta, even JSOC teams. The best combat medic I ever worked with wore Navy blues. That's her. That's who you just tried to fire. Hargrove stood up. His face was scarlet. The veins in his neck were bulging like cables about to snap. This is insane. This is a fabrication. She lied on her application, she forged credentials, she performed procedures. The conference room doors opened. A 2-star general in dress uniform walked in with the bearing of a man who had commanded 15,000 soldiers. His ribbons went from his collar to his ribs. His shoes reflected the fluorescent lights like a mirror. Behind him came an FBI agent with credentials already visible in her left hand, Morrison printed on the badge clipped to her belt. The general stopped directly in front of Dr. Hargrove. His voice was the kind of quiet that fills entire rooms without raising an octave. Doctor, you just tried to fire a decorated Navy combat veteran who saved the life of one of my officers. You fabricated disciplinary charges against a woman who earned the Navy Cross bleeding in the sand. And you did it to cover up your own criminal enterprise. Hargrove's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I've read the financial records, the general continued. $240,000 in kickbacks from Medtronic between January and April. Inflated billing codes. Ghost surgeries. A network of board members and hospital administrators all getting a percentage. You built a cancer inside this institution. He nodded to Agent Morrison. He's all yours. The handcuffs were stainless steel. They caught the light as Morrison stepped forward. Dr. Hargrove, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent. The rest of the Miranda warning continued in a flat professional tone while Hargrove tried to back away, while the board members stood up from their chairs and moved toward the walls like fish scattering from a predator. His face was the color of a bruised plum. The veins in his neck looked ready to burst. This is a mistake, he was saying, his voice high and thin now, nothing like the voice that had knocked trays to the floor or thrown charts at her feet. I'm a respected physician, I'm a donor to this hospital, you can't walk, Morrison said simply. The perp walk happened in real time, in front of the entire hospital staff. News cameras appeared in the hallway as security escorted Hargrove toward the exit. Local Denver news had been waiting in the parking lot since the FBI first arrived with warrants. The cameras captured everything, the doctor in handcuffs being led past the nurse's station, past residents whose careers he had manipulated, past the trauma bay where Brooke had performed a needle decompression with hand steady as a surgical laser while his voice was yelling about unauthorized procedures. She didn't watch him go. She didn't need to. Inside the conference room, the board chair turned to face her. The man looked physically older than he had been 5 minutes ago, as if watching one of his own colleagues arrested had aged him by years. Senior Chief Sullivan, on behalf of Oak Creek Memorial, I apologize. We failed you. We failed to protect you. We failed to investigate. We failed to. His voice broke. He was a man watching his institution collapse inward, watching the structure he had helped build crack at the foundation. We all failed her, the general said quietly. He turned to face the room. A decorated Navy officer came to work at this hospital seeking anonymity because the symptoms of post-traumatic stress were too severe to manage in her old life. She needed to disappear. Instead of offering her that safety, you exposed her. Instead of protecting her, you conspired against her. Captain Webb wheeled himself closer to Brooke. His leg was in a cast from hip to ankle. The doctor said he would regain mobility, but it would take months. He was the man whose commanding officer she had been hiding from, the one who had known her for 3 tours and had just spent 4 days in a hospital bed asking the nursing staff if they knew who had performed his emergency decompression. "Your son," he said to her, and his voice carried weight that only they could fully understand. "He talks about you. He doesn't know where you are, but he carries your photo. He knows what you did in Helmand. He knows you're a senior chief. He's proud of you." Brooke covered her mouth. Her hands were shaking now, but not from fear. This was something else. This was the tremor of a dam breaking after years of being sealed. She looked at her daughter, at Emma standing rigid in her small chair, and then at the general who was holding something in his hand. Something small. Something faded. A unit patch. The Army Ranger scrolled emblem, frayed at the edges, the stitching loose from where it had been sewn inside a jacket lining through 3 tours, for countries, and 100 missions. The same patch her son wore now. The same patch she had earned bleeding in the sand. "You've earned the right to display this in the light," the general said. He set it on the table. "Senior Chief, I knew your record before I walked in here. Every deployment. Every commendation. Every time you saved someone's life. I didn't know you'd been hiding. I didn't know you were fighting this alone." Emma reached over and took her mother's hand. The girl's grip was tight enough to hurt. Brooke squeezed back and allowed herself to cry for the first time in 4 days, no longer ashamed of the tears, no longer afraid that someone would see her break. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum, and beneath that, the soft mechanical breathing of Captain Webb's oxygen supply, the distant beeping of monitors in the trauma bays below, the outside world's white noise continuing on, unaware that someone's entire life had just been reconstructed. 6 months later, Brooke walked through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial wearing a white coat with the Director of Emergency Medicine embroidered in dark blue thread. Staff members greeted her with respect that bordered on reverence. Some of them had watched her perform that needle decompression at 0300. Some of them had witnessed her composure during humiliation. All of them had watched her disappear into suspension, had assumed she was gone forever. Now she was walking their hallways with authority that you couldn't fabricate, with the bearing of someone who had already survived the worst the world could offer. Her office was on the 3rd floor. The faded Ranger unit patch hung in a black frame on the wall between her Navy Cross citation and a photograph of her son in uniform, taken in full deployment gear at a forward operating base in Loga Province. Her daughter did homework on the couch during after-school hours, pencil scratching against paper while Brooke reviewed staff schedules and hospital protocols. The tremor in her hands had stopped. Loud noises still made her pause, the slamming of trauma bay doors, the sharp beeping of a monitor alarm, the sudden roar of an ambulance siren in the bay, but she breathed through them now instead of flinching away. She had reconnected with her sister. She was seeing a VA counselor every Thursday. She had video called her son from his forward operating base and watched him cry when she explained where she had been, what she had survived, why she had needed to disappear into Oak Creek Memorial as an invisible night shift nurse. He had told her he was proud. He had asked for her forgiveness. She had given it freely. In a strip mall parking lot across Denver, between a tax preparation service and a nail salon, Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table in a cheap polo shirt selling supplemental insurance policies to disinterested passers-by. His medical license was suspended pending criminal trial. His country club membership was revoked. His expensive car was sold at auction. His wife had filed for divorce. He was a man watching his entire world compress into something small and worthless, and there was no one left in his life to help him carry it. Captain Marcus Webb visited Brooke's office in full dress uniform before deploying back to his unit. His leg had healed. He walked with a slight limp that might never fully resolve, but the doctors said he would be combat ready by deployment. He handed her an envelope. "Your son asked me to give you this," he said. She opened it while he stood in dress uniform with his hands at his sides, and read her son's letter, words about strength and understanding and love, about how he always knew she was the strongest person he would ever meet, about how it made sense now, All of it, why she had disappeared, why the nightmares had become too much to carry in the place where everyone knew her name. Brooke set down the letter and allowed herself to cry, and Webb did something that technically violated protocol between Navy and Army, between officer and enlisted, but honored something deeper than regulations. He saluted her. She returned it. Neither spoke. Words would have been unnecessary. Final shift of the month, Brooke was walking through the ER at 2,100 hours when the trauma bay doors slammed open with the violent sound of wheels hitting the threshold. The noise that used to send her to the supply closet with her hands over her ears now brought her running toward the sound instead. She moved through the bay with authority that was absolute, with hands that had held lives together in the sand and continued holding them together in Denver. The faded patch was in her office now, displayed in the light where everyone could see it, where she didn't have to hide anymore. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. Sometimes in quiet places where no one's watching. Sometimes for years before anyone realizes who they really are. If you or someone you know is struggling with PTSD after military service, the VA has resources available, and there's no shame in asking for help. Subscribe for more stories of quiet heroes finding their way home. Like this video if you believe in second chances. And comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you'd already survived?